Imagine getting ready for a big party,
Yeah.
right? You're in your new home, excited, getting ready for a housewarming party with like over 200 people coming, friends, everybody ready to celebrate, and then your son vanishes. It's a terrifying thought, and that's exactly what Wanda Doral faced back in 1976. It's the mystery we're going to be looking at today, the disappearance of Jay Dow.
Yeah, that's a parent's worst nightmare, right? And
Mhm.
to have it happen during a time when there should be joy and celebration, makes it even more unsettling. What's really strange about this case is even though there were so many people around, potential witnesses, it's remained a mystery for decades. How does that happen?
So let's go back in time to 1976, Omaha, Nebraska. Jay Dow, a young boy who loved animals, dreamed of becoming a vet, vanishes from his home in the Riverside Lakes community, last seen riding his bike towards the Elkhorn River, his dog, Tex, right by his side.
That river, the Elkhorn River, becomes a really crucial point in the investigation early on. Wanda, frantic, obviously, trying to find her son, she immediately contacts the police. But back then, sadly, the response to missing children cases, especially in the 70s, it wasn't as immediate as it should have been.
And then to make things even more confusing, Jay's bike is found in the Elkhorn River.
Yeah.
And of course, the immediate thought is, oh, maybe he drowned.
Yeah.
It seemed plausible, at first glance.
Right. But then weeks later, Jay's body is found, not in the Elkhorn, but miles away in the Missouri River. And it wasn't just a drowning. Jay's hands were bound with wire, and there was a clear sign of trauma to the back of his head. This wasn't an accident. Someone murdered this little boy.
So many new questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did his body end up in a different river? Who would do such a horrific thing? Was this some random act, or did Jay know his attacker?
And the fact that his body was moved, that suggests that someone was trying to hide what they did.
Right.
That adds a whole other level of premeditation to this. It makes you really wonder about their motive, right?
It gets even more complicated as the investigation goes on, because they release multiple suspect sketches. One shows a middle-aged man in a blue car. Another shows a weathered laborer. And the descriptions were vague. We know now that some of them might have been based on Wanda working with a psychic and a private investigator.
A psychic, huh? That's interesting. Especially for that time period. I mean, today people might be a little more skeptical about that, but back then it was more common. So did that lead investigators down the wrong path, or did those leads just never get followed up on? I mean, it's something to think about, right?
2 years pass, and there's a huge development. A 17-year-old named John Raven confesses to killing Jay. What's really chilling is how detailed his confession is. He gives details that were never shared with the public. He describes the wire binding Jay's hands, the specific location of the head injury, details that perfectly match the evidence.
Wow, a confession with that level of detail. You'd think that would be a major break in the case, right? But then things take a turn.
Raven takes back his confession, claims he only confessed to get back into jail. But here's the thing. He passes a polygraph test, and he's released.
So now you've got a confession, a retraction, and a polygraph. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Was Raven telling the truth at first and then got scared? Or was it all a lie and the polygraph was wrong? It makes you question everything.
In the middle of all this, you have Wanda Jay's mother still searching for answers, dealing with unimaginable grief. She eventually writes a memoir, and it gives you a really raw, emotional look at her journey to find justice for her son.
Her memoir becomes a crucial part of understanding this whole thing, not just for her emotional journey, but it also gives a glimpse into the investigation from a mother's perspective. And she strongly believed that Jay's killer was responsible for other crimes, even though the police never found evidence to support that.
It's just heartbreaking. Even after all these years, the pain of losing a child, especially when it's unsolved, that never goes away.
We have to remember that back in the 70s, things were different, right? Investigative techniques weren't as advanced forensic science. It wasn't what it is today. And I think that's a big part of understanding why there might have been limitations or even missteps in Jay's case.
You're right. When you look back at cases from that time, it's easy to think, why didn't they do this or that? But you have to consider the context, the tools and knowledge they had at the time.
Absolutely. For example, there's very little documentation about the condition of Jay's body when it was found. That's a huge problem. Today, you'd have detailed reports, decomposition, water temperature, all sorts of environmental factors that could help determine a more accurate time of death. But back then, they just didn't routinely collect that information.
And without that information, it's almost impossible to put together a solid timeline, right? Especially when you consider that his body was found in a different river than where his bike was.
Yeah, exactly. Without those pieces of the puzzle, it's really hard to say how long his body was actually in the water. And that could have been crucial in figuring out who might have been involved or checking alibis.
And then there's the whole issue with the suspect sketches.
Hmm.
Some were from eyewitnesses, but others were developed with the help of a psychic. How do you even begin to make sense of that?
It's a tough one. Eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable, especially in a stressful situation like this. Memories get distorted, details get mixed up, and then you add in the psychic element,
Yeah.
which, like I said, was more accepted back then, but it adds a whole other layer of uncertainty to everything.
It sounds like the investigators were dealing with a lot of conflicting information, and it's hard to tell if they were able to separate what was real and what wasn't.
Yeah, and you also have to remember that law enforcement just didn't have the resources they have now. No advanced DNA testing, no facial recognition software, no national databases. So their ability to cross-reference information or track down leads, it was much more limited.
Makes you wonder if any of those leads that went cold back then could be revived with today's technology, right? Could they get DNA from the wire that was used to tie Jay's hands? Could facial recognition be used to analyze those sketches and maybe find new leads?
It's definitely possible. Cold cases often get solved because of advances in forensics. What might have been a dead end years ago could be a new starting point now.
And then there's John Raven's confession. That's the most confusing part of this whole thing. He gives specific details, but then he takes it back and says he lied. How do you even explain that?
It's a classic case of conflicting evidence. The details make the confession seem believable, but then you have the retraction and the polygraph. So was he pressured into confessing and then the polygraph just confirmed his lie? Or was there something else going on that we just don't know about?
It's hard to understand why someone would confess to something so awful and then just take it back.
Mm.
Was he maybe trying to protect someone else? Or did he have some connection to Jay that he didn't want anyone to know about?
All valid questions. We have to consider the possibility that his confession, while it had true details, might have been motivated by something other than actual guilt. Maybe he wanted attention, or he was intentionally trying to mislead the investigators. Who knows?
It's frustrating to think that there might be answers hidden away in those old files. But finding them takes time, a lot of effort, and maybe even some luck.
And that's why it's so important to keep these cases alive, keep investigating, and keep the public informed. Sometimes all it takes is a new perspective or someone remembering something they thought was unimportant to break a case wide open.
It's like a chain reaction, right? The more we talk about these cases, the greater the chance that someone with a key piece of information will come forward.
And it's not just about catching the person responsible. It's about giving closure to the families who have been living with this pain and uncertainty for so long.
Wanda Durrell, Jay's mother, she spent her life trying to get justice for her son. Her memoir shows just how strong a mother's love is and how far someone will go to find the truth.
Her story is a powerful reminder that behind every cold case are real people whose lives have been shattered. It's their strength and their hope that keeps the search for justice going.
And that's a really important point. While we might get caught up in the forensic details in the investigation, at the heart of it all, there's a human story, a need for answers, a desire for justice, and the hope that even after all this time, the truth will come out.
Yeah.
It's interesting. When we look at Jay's case, there are these bigger themes that come up. Things that we see in a lot of unsolved mysteries. Time, for example. It can be a real obstacle, but it can also be a strange advantage.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? On the one hand, time lets memories fade, evidence disappears, witnesses become harder to find. But then on the other hand, time brings new technology, new ways to look at old evidence.
Exactly. Like you mentioned earlier, DNA testing wasn't really a thing back in the 70s. Now, even a tiny sample can identify someone or rule them out. It's a level of certainty they just didn't have back then.
And it's not just DNA. Think about facial recognition software, digital databases, even social media. They can all uncover connections and leads that they couldn't even imagine back then.
Makes you think about all those old case files just sitting there. Could a fingerprint that was unusable before now be matched to someone in a database? Could a witness statement that seemed unimportant suddenly make sense with new information?
It shows that we shouldn't give up hope on these cold cases. With persistence, a fresh look, and the right tools, even the toughest mysteries can be solved.
And that's where public awareness is so crucial. Shows like ours, documentaries, podcasts, online forums, they all help keep these stories alive, keep them in the public eye.
Absolutely. Sometimes all it takes is one person hearing a detail or seeing a photo or remembering something they didn't think was important, and that could be the key to cracking the case.
It's like a ripple effect, right? The more these cases are talked about, the more likely it is that someone with a crucial piece of information will step forward.
And it's not just about finding the guilty party. It's about giving some closure to the families who have been waiting for answers for so long.
Wanda Durrell, Jay's mother, dedicated her life to fighting for justice for her son. Her memoir is a testament to a mother's love and how powerful the need for truth can be.
Her story reminds us that behind every cold case, there's a real human impact. Real people whose lives were forever changed by this tragedy. And it's their resilience, their hope, that keeps the search for justice alive.
It's an important reminder that while we might get into the details of the investigation and the forensic evidence, it's the human story that's at the heart of it all. The need for answers, the desire for justice, the unwavering hope that even in the darkest times, the truth will prevail.
Well said. And even though we might never know for sure what happened to Jay Dow, the ongoing investigation and keeping his story alive keeps that hope burning.
And speaking of keeping the story alive, if any of our listeners have any information about the murder of Jay Dow in 1976 near Waterloo, Nebraska, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, please contact the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. You can find their contact information on our website.
You never know. Even the smallest detail could be the missing piece of the puzzle.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the unsolved murder of Jay Dow. It's a case full of twists and turns and unanswered questions, but it's a story that needs to be told, a story that needs to be remembered.
We hope this episode has shed some light on the complexities of cold cases and the lasting impact they have on families and entire communities.
Join us next week for another fascinating true crime story. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those minds of yours sharp.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive wherever you get your podcasts. That way you won't miss an episode.
We'll see you next time.